Hello everyone, welcome back. My name is Dominic, and today we're going to be talking about generating grass, procedural grass in Maya for use with Renderman. Now this is part of a many episode series in which we talk about a couple of tools, tips, tricks, and techniques on how to create exterior 3D modeled environments for Maya Renderman. And this episode, as I mentioned before, we are just talking about grass. Today we're going to learn how to paint grass with content browser paint effects, convert that to geometry, and then use that geometry in a mesh node network system to paint instances of it onto our terrain, onto our 3D modeled terrain. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's learn how to model grass. Now, I'm not going to go through and model every grass blade. That is something that you can do, but I'm far too lazy for it, and I'm just going to use a preset from the content browser here. So this icon is the content browser, and if I click on it, I've got quite a bit of different assets that I can just very easily drag and drop into my Maya document. And the first one that we're going to use is in this folder, Paint Effects. I'm going to look for a subfolder called Grasses. And these are paint effects tools that I get to use. So I'm just going to choose a random one. This is going to be a grass clump. And if I left click and hold, drag and drop it, you'll notice that now my cursor has changed to a pencil tool. And I can essentially paint grass like so, which is very nifty. Now, I'm going to paint a clump of grass directly in the center of my document. And I'll know where the center is because on my grid there are some crosshairs and I just want to paint it directly in the center of my document. Now as I paint this grass clump, you'll notice that it has a curve assigned to it and history. So in my attribute editor to the right side, I can further modify and customize this grass clump with some of these buttons over here. So I can go through and I can change the seed to make it a little bit more random. I can mess with quite a bit of stuff to help give me the particular grass shape that I want. But this one is going to do for now. So once I'm done messing around with it, I'm going to delete history, freeze transformations, and I can now delete this hidden curve right there. And I'm left with this grass clump. Very cool. A couple of other things to note. I'm going to need a few of these. I've already gone ahead and generated these already. So once you've made a couple of these grass clumps, and for the sake of variety and randomness, we now have to convert this paint effect into geometry for our mesh node network system. In order to do that, we can go up to the very top where it says modify. I can go down here to this drop down called convert. And then I'm going to click on Paint Effects to Polygons. Now what that does is that generates a mesh based on my paint effect. It converts it over. So with that being said, I can now delete that paint effect and just be left with this geometry right here. Now, another thing that we're going to do is we are going to get this one ready for Renderman by assigning it a Pixar material. We're going to do this before we start using the mesh node network system because as I paint, a bajillion more of these, I want them all to have the same material. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to open up my Hypershade and I'm going to hit Tab and I'm going to type in Pixar Marschner. This is a new type of material that we haven't really dabbled around with. And this is a material that is usually used for things like grooms, so hair and fur. That being said, it's going to work really nice for our grass geometry that we're going to use today. Now, while we're here, we can kind of push this into kind of a grass-like color. A very important attribute to change is going to be these primary specular colors. So you can modify. I'm going to push the secondary to a cool green and the transmit to kind of this warm yellow green, which will give it a really nice kind of lively look to it. And as you can see in my preview, I've got this really fun spectrum of warm and cool green that's going to look great on my grass. So I can rename this And I can always come over to this Lambert, change it to, you know, maybe a green color, so that way it's in my viewport, I'll be able to see it. My grass for clump main, I'm going to right click, assign existing material, give it that Marschner, and now I've got this one good to go. So I'm over here and I've got a few of these now. And as I mentioned before, they are all converted to geometry. They all have a Marschner assigned to them, and they are all ready for our node network system. So let's go ahead and start projecting these onto our terrain. Now I've got my terrain built over here. This terrain was used was created by Gaia, and I'll have another video that talks about how to use Gaia and its node-based terrain generation capabilities to quickly generate, you know, kind of ground, much like this, in another video, of course. So once we have our terrain and it's modeled, and you know, I've set up the Pixar surface and everything else for it as well. Let me just go ahead and make sure. Yep, I've got my normal map, I've got my color map, I've got the specular turned quite a bit high because I want this nice and rough. Then we can go ahead and start using the Mesh node network system to, of course, paint on top of this. So in order to do this, I'm going to switch my shelf, my workspace, from modeling to FX, where then I can get the Mesh node network dropdown. So first things first, let's go ahead and select all of the grass clumps that we've made. In this case, I've made 3 down here. I'm going to go up to Mesh, and I want to create a Mesh network. Now, before I click on this, I'm actually going to open the tool settings just to double check that I have the geometry type selected as instancer instead of mesh. I don't necessarily want it to be on mesh because that would mean as I paint 1,000 more clumps of grass, it's going to exponentially multiply how much geometry I've got in my document, which can, of course, be detrimental to our workflow. Instancer kind of projects those clumps of grass that I will be multiplying or spreading out onto this terrain without actually generating more geometry. So it's going to be a lot nicer on the PC for this. So with instancer selected, I'm going to hit apply. I can close out of that window, and now I've got a mesh network in my outliner, and my attributes allow me a library that I can assign what's mesh distribution node that I want to use. In this case, we're going to use the placer node right here. So if I click on add placer node, now I've got this new distribution system that I can use to paint, essentially, the grass clumps onto this geometry. So let's go ahead and get to it. First things first, I need to specify what geometry I want to paint on. So I'm just going to come over to this icon where my terrain is, drag and drop, and now it knows that we want to paint on this terrain map. Let's go ahead and talk about these attributes from top to bottom. The brush radius will indicate how large of a paintbrush I will be painting my grass with. I'm going to leave that alone for now, but essentially, if I start painting, you can see the radius of my brush that's being used right here. That, of course, can increase or decrease. Spacing will control how often I will be stamping a grass clump within there. So obviously, if I reduce this number, then it'll look more of like a continuous line. Whereas if I increase that number, it will look a little bit more sporadic. I'm going to keep this relatively low for now. I am going to check on the scatter button, and what that allows me to do is as I paint, it's going to randomly kind of space out the clumps of grass within my brush radius. So this is kind of cool. Now that also means that if my brush radius is larger, then you can see it has more real estate for it to kind of distribute itself on. This also plays with the scatter density, where if I increase this, then now it takes me less time for me to really fill up the radius of my brush with grass, versus if it was set low to, for example, 1, now it's taking a little bit longer. So my density controls how many clumps of grass it will distribute into my brush every stamp. So I'm going to leave that relatively high at 3 for now. This stuff we're going to leave alone. This kind of talks about how your mesh is going to or how your grass clumps are going to interact with the mesh. In this case, we like the default settings. We're going to scroll down to these random modifiers over here. So the first one we're going to mess around with is this random scale. Right now it's set from 1 to 1, which means that every grass clump that I place looks or is the exact same scale as the other. However, I want a little bit more variety. So I'm going to actually enter in a minimum and a maximum range. Let's say from 0.5 to 1.2. And just like that, as I'm painting in, you'll notice that while it's the same grass clump, some of them are a little bit smaller and some of them are a little bit larger. So that's kind of nice. I'm also going to enter in a random Y rotation range to 50 degrees. And this means that as I'm painting this grass in, it's going to be able to kind of rotate or jitter in its rotation. So that way it also kind of breaks up the uniformity. Now, something very important to note down here is we're going to change our ID mode from fixed to random. We have multiple grass clumps up here, and I want to be able to use all 3 of them. So by changing our ID mode to random, I can now enter in a range of IDs. That means a range of geometries for it to look for. In this case, I want the range to start at 0 and to end at 2. So it finds that 0 is this guy right here, clump 1. 1 is this one right here, and 2 is this one right here. So that means that as I'm painting, it's going to randomly pick from my 3 grass clumps and place it down. So again, these attributes that we're talking about in this portion is mainly just to break up the uniformity and to add variety in this grass that we're painting. So with that said and done, let's go ahead and start painting our terrain. And I'm just going to left click and drag alongside maybe these greener areas right here, kind of treating it like patches of grass. And now the more dense that you make this, the more strain that you're going to put onto your computer. So just keep that in mind as you're working. But I kind of like this random meadow field that we're working with right here. And I'm trying to think about how I want this grass to kind of interact with some of the more rocky portions and some of the more lush portions of this particular terrain. So maybe along these flat areas, I'm going to have more grass. Like here and here and here. Now you can also use, if you have a tablet, your stylus to do this work for you. But for now, I'm just going to use my cursor or my mouse. And maybe some grass down here in this kind of cavern area. There we go. So obviously we can paint quite a bit more than this, but for the sake of this demo, we're just going to wrap it up right here as soon as we get some nice kind of lush fields going. And then we're going to hop back into our Hypershade and talk just a little bit more about our Marschner material properties. So all of this grass that we're painting is not necessarily real geometry. And as you look at the very top, the amount of vertices, the amount of polygons that I've got in this document does not change, no matter how much I'm putting in here. And this is because we changed our mesh node network type to instancing, right? And so we're just pretending that this grass is going to be here. It's going to look like it's physically there, but it doesn't actually exist as geometry. The only geometry that we have is just the original 3. All right, that's looking very nice. I'm going to go ahead and save. And we can hop into our Hypershade to talk about this Marschner. So, as I mentioned before, the color properties that you can modify within here are going to be your simple diffuse color, in which this case I'm going to set as a nice cool green for now. You've got specular color ranges down here. So primary specular, this is kind of how rough and how gritty things are. Think of it like highlights in hair. And then you also have transmit specular color. So as color as light penetrates through this grass, what colors do you want it to shine as? And for me, I want it to be a nice yellow. So we're going to change our colors accordingly. And when we render this out with Renderman, we'll be able to see those changes and, of course, go back and modify it if necessary. So in order to get a good render out of this, I'm going to create a dome light. This dome light's just going to have my panorama HDR just to get a nice lighting scenario here. And then we can run our Renderman render. And as you can see, it's going to take a little bit of time for all of the noise of our grass to start reading out the way that we want it to, but it's already looking pretty interesting. We've got really nice highlights that are coming through from the way that we had set up our Marschner, and we are getting this really fun, lush grass. So while we're in here, I'm going to go ahead and discard these changes because I want to modify my environment in my Hypershade a little bit just to better fit the look that we want. So I'm going to run an IPR render. That way it modifies or it updates as we're going. Let's go to next image. There we go. And while that's stirring about, I'm noticing that my Pixar surface over here is a little bit too glossy, and I'm seeing quite a bit of highlights in there. So I'm going to crank this roughness quite a bit higher. And that's going to help kind of tone down some of this. Now, my Marschner is a little bit too bright, and that's probably from this transmit specular color. So I'm going to lower the value of that. And now you can see it really starts to dim things down, which is kind of nice. And so as far as it goes, that's all there is to very quickly getting in grass procedurally into your 3D environment. Now, as we're generating vegetation throughout other episodes and things like that, or in your own projects, something important to note. Variety is the key to getting these to feel more natural. Obviously, we only used one type of grass in our content browser, but I highly encourage you to repeat these steps with multiple types of grasses. And in our content browser, we've got quite a bit to choose from. So if I go back to our modeling content browser, you can see the variety that we've got to deal with. So I highly recommend mixing and matching in your mesh network different types of grass with different color options and different variety to help kind of break up the uniformity. Even though we put in a lot of work to add some jitter in the scale and jitter in the rotation, you'll notice that they are still all the same color, and we want it to feel a little bit more lively than that because we see all sorts of different colors as there are grass at different ages that might be dead, that might be very new sprouts. We might also see different weeds and different other types of plants growing within our environments, but hopefully this gives you a good idea of what pipeline that we're going to be looking for when generating foliage like this. So of course, if you have any questions, do please and let me know. Hopefully this you will find helpful in your own projects as you generate environments. And of course, I wish you guys the best of luck. So thanks again. We'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.